At precisely 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the geometric lattice of a crystalline molecule undergoes a violent structural collapse. It does not burn. It does not vaporize. The rigid atomic bonds shatter, and the mineral transitions from a solid into a dense liquid. In the exact fraction of a second that this phase shift occurs, a profound thermodynamic theft takes place. To sustain its own melting process, the crystal rips massive quantities of heat directly out of the surrounding air, gorging itself on thermal energy. The ambient air drops in temperature. The room grows cold. The mineral sits in absolute silence. You have been taught your entire life that erasing heat requires roaring compressors, synthetic refrigerants, and an unbreakable tether to the electrical grid. That is an industrial illusion. There is a mineral sitting in your kitchen cabinets right this very second that possesses the capacity to soak up more ambient heat, pound for pound, than nearly any modern building material ever tested in a laboratory. Salt, plain, ordinary, unglamorous salt. And a very specific family of these salts, materials you can acquire for roughly the cost of a mediocre lunch, will actively pull the stagnant heat out of a living space, trap that thermal energy throughout the blistering afternoon, and gracefully release it back into the world when the sun goes down. There is no humming compressor. There is no pressurized Freon. There is no monthly utility bill. A $40 batch of the correct chemical salt can execute, in total silence, the exact thermal regulation that a massive machine bolted to the side of your house does loudly, expensively, and only for as long as the electrical grid decides to function. This brings us to a historical anomaly that should deeply unsettle you. If this phenomenon is real, if the material is this remarkably cheap, and if the chemistry has been exhaustively documented since the 1600s, why has the modern architectural establishment hidden it from you? Because there is no recurring revenue in a phase shift. You cannot sell a man a bag of salt twice. You cannot attach a digital meter to a melting crystal. You cannot remotely shut off a thermodynamic reaction from a corporate server when a homeowner's monthly payment is late. An entire global infrastructure was deliberately constructed to do exactly that. Follow this timeline carefully, because by the time we conclude, you will possess the underlying physics, the historical record, and the exact names of the pioneers who preserved this mechanical truth while it was being systematically purged from the engineering textbooks. Let us begin with the biological and structural pain, because you are already intimately familiar with it. It is the peak of August. The late afternoon sun strikes the western exposure of your dwelling like a kinetic weapon. The structural envelope of your house absorbs this radiation, trapping the heat within the drywall and timber long after the sky has gone dark. You lie awake at 11 o'clock at night, and the atmosphere in the bedroom is thick, stagnant, and suffocating. The architectural design of the structure has entirely failed you, and the only solution the market permits you to purchase is a metal box. A box that requires a continuous intravenous feed of electricity, consumes wattage at staggering rates, and inevitably suffers mechanical failure at the exact moment of maximum thermal stress. The average central air conditioning apparatus in this nation requires a massive capital extraction simply to install. The act of cooling a structure frequently consumes the largest single percentage of a summer utility ledger. The chemical blood running through these machines has been federally regulated, banned, chemically reformulated, and subsequently banned again. The mechanical heart of the unit, the compressor, is deliberately engineered with a service life of perhaps 12 to 15 years, after which the entire financial bloodletting repeats itself. You do not own a cooling system. You lease a temporary delay of the inevitable from corporations that engineered the machine to be leased forever. Here is the truth that exposes the failure of modern design. For the vast majority of human history, in some of the most brutally unforgiving and scorching environments on this planet, none of this machinery existed. There was no electrical grid. There were no patented refrigerants. There were no monthly statements. Yet, human beings slept in the cool dark. They did not accomplish this through mysticism. They achieved it through a rigorous mastery of materials. They weaponized water, heavy stone, fluid dynamics, the freezing void of the night sky, and salt. Let me explain the precise scientific mechanism of the salt, because it mimics magic, but it is strictly chemistry. It is a biological and structural truth understood for nearly 2 centuries. When specific salts are bound with water in absolute, precise mathematical ratios, they form what materials scientists classify as a phase change material. The most heavily documented of these is sodium sulfate. When combined with water, it creates a compound historically classified by chemists as Glauber's salt. It bears the name of Johann Glauber, the 17th century German-Dutch chemist who first meticulously recorded its properties. Glauber's salt possesses a highly specific, fundamentally disruptive physical habit. It melts at precisely 90 degrees Fahrenheit. It does not boil. It melts. It shifts from a solid crystal into a liquid state right at the threshold of an uncomfortably hot room. And here is the entire mechanical secret, distilled into a single physical law. In order to achieve that liquid state, the salt must consume an astronomical volume of thermal energy. It forcefully extracts that heat from the air surrounding it, yet the salt itself barely registers an increase in temperature. Consider the fundamental difference between warming a vessel of water and boiling it. You can elevate the temperature of water from a cold state to the threshold of boiling using a baseline amount of kinetic energy. But to force that practically boiling water to cross the threshold into vapor and to steam requires a violent injection of energy, roughly 5 times the original amount, even though the measurable temperature of the water remains entirely static. That hidden vault of power, the energy strictly required to force a material to change its physical state rather than simply elevating its temperature, is known as latent heat. It is massive. Glauber's salt aggressively stores approximately 108 British thermal units in every single pound of its mass as it melts. Compare that to the structural mass of standard concrete or fired brick, which can only manage to absorb a pathetic fraction of that energy for the exact same temperature shift. A modest, properly sealed tray of this salt, melting silently within the cavity of your wall, absorbs the brute force of the afternoon sun exactly the way a dry sponge pulls standing water from a stone floor. The living space remains entirely comfortable because the salt is occupied with the physical labor of melting, refusing to allow the ambient air to heat up. Then, the planet rotates. The night falls. The ambient temperature drops below the 90-degree threshold, and the salt undergoes a reverse phase shift. It freezes completely solid, purging the stored heat back into the environment, mechanically resetting its own thermal capacity for free. It is fully armed for the morning. It melts at 90 degrees Fahrenheit. It still melts at 90 degrees Fahrenheit today, exactly as it did 4 centuries ago. Physics did not change. The business model did. Who first recognized the structural utility of this thermodynamic theft? This is where the historical record demands a specific name. In 1948, within the freezing borders of Dover, Massachusetts, a chemist named Maria Telkes constructed a dwelling that actively heated itself through a brutal New England winter, requiring virtually zero combustible fuel. They called her the Sun Queen. She was a Hungarian-American scientist operating out of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and she executed a mechanical feat the global engineering establishment had declared impossible. She engineered a habitat, the Dover Sun House, that captured solar radiation during the daylight hours and locked that thermal energy inside steel bins of Glauber's salt, buried deep within the walls. She did not architect this defiance alone. The structure was designed by Eleanor Raymond and financed by a sculptor and philanthropist named Amelia Peabody. 3 women in 1948 built a structure that survived the Northeast winter, running on nothing but sunlight and crystalline salt. The mineral matrix absorbed the day's heat as it melted, and as the Massachusetts nights dropped well below the freezing point, the salt solidified in the dark, violently purging its stored heat into the living space. Analyze exactly what this proves. Telkes weaponized the salt to hoard heat. But a phase change material is blind to human seasons. The exact same thermodynamic principle that forces a wall to radiate warmth in January can be deployed to consume heat in August. Choose a specific salt blend that liquefies at the exact ambient temperature you wish to maintain, and the wall transforms into a thermal flywheel. It aggressively resists every atmospheric swing. It flattens the thermal peaks. It mechanically prevents the apex of the afternoon from turning your living quarters into an oven. This was not fringe experimentation. NASA deployed phase change materials to buffer the thermal extremes of orbital spacecraft and extravehicular pressure suits. In the vacuum of orbit, an astronaut swings violently between brutal solar radiation and absolute freezing darkness, requiring a mechanical buffer that does not rely on fragile, power-hungry compressors. The United States Department of Energy and the Oak Ridge National Laboratory have published exhaustive research on phase change materials integrated into structural envelopes for decades. The science is absolute. The physics are settled. The only variable ever in dispute was the margin of profit. Which brings us directly to the architect of your thermal cage. In 1902, a young engineer named Willis Carrier constructed the first modern electric air conditioning apparatus. It was an undeniably brilliant application of thermodynamics. It solved a legitimate crisis, first for a Brooklyn printing plant, then for commercial theaters, and finally for the entire nation. By the 1950s, the concept of synthetic cooling was being aggressively marketed as the American dream delivered in a steel box. But analyze the exact nature of this solution. It was a machine. It demanded a permanent, unbroken intravenous feed of metered electricity. It required a highly specific, patented refrigerant. And when the apex of chemical refrigerants was synthesized, the door to the cage swung shut. In the late 1920s, a mechanical engineer at General Motors named Thomas Midgley helped develop the specific chemical chain that DuPont would trademark and sell to the globe as Freon. Here is the most critical attribute of Freon. It could be legally owned. You cannot legally claim ownership over the freezing vacuum of the night sky. You cannot trademark the solar radiation that strikes the Earth. You cannot attach a utility meter to a bag of sodium sulfate. But a global corporation can absolutely own, patent, and brand a synthetic fluorocarbon. They can manufacture it, sell it, legislate its necessity, and force you to purchase more of it every single year until the day you die. Do you see the structural difference? On one side, you possess a crystalline mineral you purchase exactly once. It functions for decades. It cannot be branded, it cannot be metered, and it cannot be remotely deactivated by a corporate server. On the other side, you have a hermetically sealed metal box filled with patented toxins, entirely reliant on a fragile electrical grid, engineered with a fatalistic expiration date. One of these is a product designed to be sold forever. The other is a mute rock that executes its physics and asks absolutely nothing of you. Guess which one received the advertising budget? Guess which mechanism was systematically written into municipal building codes, federal mortgage standards, and the baseline definition of a civilized home? It was not defeated in a laboratory. It was outspent. If you have followed this logic, you now possess a superior understanding of structural thermal dynamics than nearly any modern homeowner alive. Now, let us examine the mechanical realities. I owe you the brutal physics, not optimism. We will address the immediate objections. The primary concern is always humidity. What about condensation? What about toxic mold? It is the correct question to ask. Here is the absolute truth. A properly engineered phase change array never exposes the raw mineral to your ambient air. It exists inside a hermetically sealed vault. A polymer pouch, a rigid tile. It undergoes violent phase shifts entirely in the dark. It never touches your breathing air. It never sweats moisture into your structural cavities the way an uninsulated cold water pipe does. The threat of condensation only exists when a violently cold surface meets a saturated atmosphere. A correctly calibrated salt panel hovers mere degrees from the room temperature. This is not a block of ice. It is a thermal buffer. However, if you defy the physics, if you construct this recklessly and allow raw salt to sit in an open tray, you will absolutely engineer a catastrophic humidity and corrosion crisis. Salt aggressively destroys exposed metal. That is precisely why the sealing protocol and the material science are the entire foundation of the system, and why I refuse to hand you an incomplete, reckless methodology. The second objection: will this physical law operate in my specific geographic climate? This answer hinges on a single, uncompromising meteorological metric. Do your nights cool down? The salt gorged itself on heat all day as it melted. To reset its capacity for tomorrow, it must violently purge that energy and freeze solid. It can only execute this phase shift when the ambient night air plummets below the salt's melt point. In a dry climate, the high desert, the American Southwest, the mountain states, the night atmosphere frequently plummets 20 to 30 degrees below the daytime apex. That thermal chasm is the engine. The salt melts by day, freezes by night, and resets. It operates with ruthless efficiency. But in a suffocatingly humid climate, the deep south, the Gulf Coast in the dead of August, the night atmosphere barely drops. The salt remains saturated, trapped in its liquid state, rendered entirely useless until the weather breaks. I will tell you this plainly. This mechanism is a thermal titan in dry climates and any geography with a violent day-to-night temperature swing. It is a crippled, ineffective tool in hot, sticky, stagnant southern nights. This is not a concealed flaw. It is physics. And the architects who originally manipulated these physical laws knew this intimately. Which brings us to the historical preservationists, the anonymous masters who weaponized thermodynamics thousands of years before any European chemist assigned it a name. Look to the arid expanse of ancient Persia. In the merciless deserts of what is now Iran, structural engineers raised towering vertical shafts above their rooflines, known as badgers, windcatchers. These monolithic towers were engineered to capture high-altitude kinetic air currents, violently channel them down into the living quarters, and force the stagnant, superheated air out through precise pressure differentials. In the modern city of Yazd, these towers have been freezing the interiors of homes for centuries. Some have stood for hundreds of years. They operate with brutal efficiency. Zero moving parts, zero electrical draw. These same desert engineers carved qanats, subterranean aqueducts that transported freezing water for miles beneath the earth. They meticulously paired the vertical wind towers with these underground channels. The incoming atmospheric air was forced over the freezing water, plummeting its temperature before it ever touched a human being. It was a flawless synthesis of evaporative and geothermal cooling, engineered and perfected 8 full centuries before Willis Carrier was even born. Then, they escalated the physics. They constructed the yachtchal, massive domed structures engineered to actively manufacture and store ice in the middle of a baking desert. Consider the profound mechanics of this achievement. In an environment that incinerates the earth by day, Persian builders utilized the absolute freezing void of the clear night sky to aggressively radiate ground heat upward, intentionally freezing shallow pools of water. They then hoarded that manufactured ice underground throughout the entirety of the summer. They were harvesting the freezing vacuum of outer space with mud bricks. NASA currently utilizes a highly specific modern term for this thermodynamic principle: radiative sky cooling. The Persians were executing it flawlessly before the year 1200. Travel to the American Southwest, and you witness the exact same thermal mastery executed by different hands. The Pueblo and Hopi populations engineered their habitats using adobe walls built from a dense composite of raw earth and fibrous straw, constructed up to 2 feet thick. That structural mass functions on the exact same delay principle as the sodium sulfate, just at a slower, biological pace. The dense masonry absorbs the brute force of the day's solar radiation so slowly, so stubbornly, that the interior atmosphere remains remarkably cold. By the time the kinetic heat finally bleeds through the earth and reaches the interior walls, the sun has set, and the freezing desert night has arrived to rip the heat back out. Walk into a century-old adobe structure at high noon in July. The atmosphere inside is violently colder than the blazing exterior. No machine, just mass, just patience. The early Mormon pioneers in the Utah territories documented and replicated these exact physical laws. Prior to 1945, farmhouses across the American continent were deliberately engineered as thermodynamic machines. They featured profound roof overhangs, towering ceilings, meticulous cross-ventilation corridors, subterranean root cellars cut into the freezing soil, and massive shade trees planted strictly on the western exposure to intercept the afternoon sun. None of this was an architectural accident. It was a highly refined, heavily documented body of survival mechanics, continuously passed down and utilized right up until the precise historical moment a corporate salesman arrived. The salesman convinced a generation that manipulating physics was archaic, and the only modern solution was a vibrating metal box bolted to a window. The United States government itself mathematically proved these old methods. For decades, the United States Department of Agriculture published farmers' bulletins. These were dense, pragmatic manuals, teaching civilians exactly how to excavate a cooling cellar, how to mathematically ventilate a roofline, and how to weaponize earth, shadow, and fluid dynamics. That data was official. It was printed. It was distributed by the tens of thousands, and then, methodically, it was erased from the cultural baseline. The new narrative was the mechanical appliance. The old narrative simply stopped printing. I recently reviewed a historical account from an individual raised on a rural agricultural property in Arizona. He noted that his grandmother's adobe structure never once contained an air conditioning unit, yet he possessed zero memory of ever being too hot to sleep. Today, he resides in a modern, lightweight stucco box that transforms into a thermal oven by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He runs his synthetic machine without pause, and he still sweats. He documented this without rage, but with a profound, quiet confusion, the realization of a man who suspects he traded away his structural sovereignty and only noticed the theft decades later. We never forgot how to execute this physics. We were simply told it was unprofitable to remember. Let us transition to absolute utility, because you are not here for historical nostalgia. You require the unvarnished reality of what a phase change mineral buffer can and cannot execute. It will not drop the temperature of a blistering room by 30 degrees in 10 minutes. That is not its physical nature. What the salt does is violently flatten the thermal curve. It has the capacity to hold an interior space several degrees cooler through the most brutal stretch of the afternoon, mechanically delaying the apex of the heat by hours. It stalls the thermodynamic assault until the sun collapses below the horizon and the night atmosphere arrives to assist you. Inside a properly engineered structure, integrated with strategic shadow and nocturnal ventilation, the effect is the absolute difference between a room you can survive in and one you cannot. The raw chemistry is absurdly cheap. Sodium sulfate, the baseline lattice of Glauber's salt, is one of the most widely available industrial minerals on the planet. It trades for pennies on the pound in bulk. The actual financial cost and the required engineering skill is not the chemical itself. It is the hermetic sealing. It is the structural placement. It is the mathematical selection of the precise melting threshold that matches your specific biological comfort zone. Execute those variables flawlessly, and you possess a passive mechanical buffer that operates for decades, resetting its own thermal capacity every single night for zero financial cost. How long does it survive? This is precisely where the mineral humiliates the machine. A hermetically sealed phase change panel possesses no vibrating compressor. It has zero moving parts. It has absolutely nothing mechanical to degrade. The singular enemy of the system is a chemical failure known as phase separation, where, over thousands of thermodynamic cycles, the salt matrix slowly settles and loses its latent heat capacity. But that chemical flaw was isolated and permanently solved in the 1940s. Maria Telkes herself mathematically defeated the separation problem using specific chemical thickening agents and mineral additives, locking the molecular suspension in place across thousands of violent melt-freeze cycles. Built correctly, you are constructing a mechanism with a lifespan measured in generations. It completely bypasses the artificial 12 to 15-year death clock built into every modern condenser unit. There is no corporate revenue in a mechanism that refuses to break. That is exactly why it was buried. Now, the engineering warnings. I do not dress up hazardous physics as a gift. Any dense mass you attach to a vertical wall or suspend in a ceiling represents a massive structural load. Saturated mineral salt is exceptionally heavy. You absolutely do not suspend this mass above your head without mathematical verification that your structural joists can carry the load. If you cannot calculate the shear force, you hire an engineer who does it for a living. A breached containment vessel inside a wall cavity is a catastrophic failure. Hermetic sealing is not a suggestion. It is the entirety of the project. Raw salt aggressively corrodes standard metals, meaning your choice of containment polymer is absolute. Keep the chemical sealed, because you never allow concentrated mineral moisture to interact with your interior breathing air. And the final absolute warning. You may be familiar with early absorption cooling technology, the chemical mechanics utilized in off-grid propane refrigeration. That historical record is accurate, and the physics are mathematically gorgeous. It operates by vaporizing raw ammonia. I will never provide you with a backyard procedure for this, and you will never attempt it. Ammonia is highly toxic, aggressively corrosive, and lethally dangerous when placed under immense atmospheric pressure. That specific thermodynamic principle belongs exclusively to certified, industrially welded, commercial-grade equipment. Admire it as history. Do not build a pressurized ammonia bomb in your garage. The mineral salt buffer is the safe, passive, structurally stable cousin. That is the physical tool I want in your hands. Who is this strictly designed for? It is for the individual operating in a dry, high-altitude desert climate where the nocturnal atmosphere plummets. It is for the homesteader, the off-grid architect, the individual engineering a new structural envelope or a remote cabin, who intends to integrate the thermal buffer into the skeleton of the building from day one. It is for any human being who demands a baseline layer of systemic independence, a structure that stubbornly refuses to heat up when the electrical grid inevitably fails. It is a physical comfort that does not arrive in the mail as a utility bill. It is not a magical replacement for mechanical air conditioning in a saturated Louisiana swamp, and I will never lie to you and claim it is. Let us return to the genesis of this architectural defiance. Let us return to the chemist in the Massachusetts, cold in 1948. Maria Telkes expended her entire existence proving that solar radiation and raw, unglamorous materials could seamlessly execute the labor we currently pay utility monopolies to perform. She registered dozens of engineering patents. She weaponized her intellect for the United States Navy, designing solar distillation units that forcefully extracted drinking water from the ocean, saving the lives of downed fighter pilots in the Pacific Theater. She spent her life chasing a singular, uncompromising truth. The kinetic energy and thermal comfort we desperately require already exist in abundance. They are completely free. They are blanketing the earth. We only lack the intellectual cunning to capture them, and the structural patience to store them. She died in 1995. Her legacy was methodically scrubbed from the cultural narrative of modern architecture. The Sun Queen was buried by the appliance. But the universe did not change its rules. This week, at exactly 17:00 hours, walk the external perimeter of your structure. Place your bare palm flat against the exterior masonry of your western-facing wall. Feel the kinetic violence of the stored solar radiation pushing back into your flesh. That specific wall is where your thermal war is either won or lost. The industrial establishment could not monetize the wind. They could not patent the freezing void of the night sky. And they could never attach a utility meter to a crystalline lattice shattering in total silence. The corporate machine demanded you forget the physics. But the geometry of the universe does not care about their business model. At precisely 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the crystal still collapses. It still steals the heat, and it still waits in the dark.